One of the more interesting arguments between steam and diesel enthusiasts has always been which type of engine was best at pulling a train. Throw out all the operating and maintenance cost factors and get right down to the heart of the matter. Which type of locomotive could best pull a train over the road at speed? I found the early steam versus diesel tests to be fascinating reading, but there never seemed to be a clear-cut winner. The articles varied from a rather dry statistical approach to a fascinating article in Trains magazine many years ago, which made the point through subjective comparison that Southern Pacific Daylight number 4449 was equal to 2.5 E8s at anything over 40 miles an hour. The mention of speed was always included in any reference to a locomotive's power, because horsepower is a measure of how fast a given amount of work can be done. For example, if we took the 1,500 horsepower diesel out of this SW1500 and replaced it with a 150 horsepower diesel, the locomotive would still operate, but with only 150 horsepower, it sure couldn't move very fast with any kind of a load. In other words, it could still perform work, but certainly not as fast because it had less horsepower. To do a lot of work like move a heavy train and do it fast, over 40 miles an hour, takes horsepower, lots of it. Comparing steam horsepower to diesel horsepower is also complicated because we are truly comparing apples and oranges. They're two completely different types of machines. In a diesel, we've got a machine that has the power curve of an electric motor because that's what's actually turning the wheels. On the other hand, a steam engine's power curve is that of a reciprocating engine, meaning the power is developed in pulses as the pistons move back and forth to turn the wheels. What is this power curve business? Well, it's nothing more than how we describe what the engine's power rating is at various speeds. Another way to state the differences between the two machines is to say that a diesel is a constant horsepower, variable pulling force machine, and a steam engine is a variable horsepower, constant pulling force machine. Anytime we talk about a locomotive's horsepower, we're really talking about two aspects of that engine's performance. How much pulling force or tractive effort can the locomotive develop, and how much of that total pulling force can be developed at high speed. Let's take a look at a typical diesel's power curve first. Just a moment ago, I said that a diesel was a constant horsepower, variable pulling force machine. If we have a 4,000 horsepower diesel, it can develop that 4,000 horsepower at any speed. The power remains constant because the diesel engine itself doesn't care how fast the locomotive is going. It'll make 4,000 horsepower anytime you ask it to. Take a look at this graph. Our 4,000 horsepower diesel can develop its full rated horsepower at all speeds. The horsepower is constant. But what about the other part of the picture, the tractive effort or pulling force? I said that a diesel's pulling force was variable, and this graph shows you what I mean. Our 4,000 horsepower diesel can develop around 80,000 pounds of pulling force. But look what happens to that pulling force as the speed increases. It remains fairly constant up to about 10 miles per hour, but starts to drop dramatically until at 60 miles an hour, the engine can develop only about 1/4 of its original pulling force. This is because if the actual horsepower remains constant, something else has to vary with speed. And in a diesel, it is the pulling force, which drops as the engine goes faster. Now, what does this kind of power curve mean in the everyday world of railroading? It means that a diesel locomotive may be able to start a very heavy train moving because it can develop a tremendous amount of pulling force at low speeds, and then not be able to get the train moving faster than 20 or 25 miles an hour because as the speed increases, the locomotive's pulling force actually drops. Look carefully at the graph, and you'll see that at about 22 miles an hour, the pulling force of the engine has already dropped by 1/4 to only 60,000 pounds. So how is a steam engine different? A few moments ago, I told you that a steam locomotive's horsepower was variable, unlike the diesel where the horsepower was constant. I also said it could develop a constant pulling force, once again unlike the diesel where the pulling force drops as the engine goes faster. The steam engine's pulling force remains constant because that force is developed by the steam pushing on the pistons. Now, it doesn't matter whether the engine's going 5 or 55 miles an hour. At full throttle, the steam pressure pushing on the pistons is the same at all speeds. So the pulling force is the same. If the pulling force stays the same and the speed is increasing, something else has to be increasing, and that's the horsepower. It's easy to see how this happens. In a reciprocating engine, like a steam locomotive, the power is developed in power pulses as each piston takes its stroke. At slow speeds, those power pulses repeat at a slow rate and are far apart, so the power developed is not very high. For example, under 20 miles an hour, the best the 765 can do is about 2,500 horsepower. But as the engine accelerates, those power pulses get closer together and occur more often, so the power level increases. This graph of the 765's horsepower curve dramatically illustrates this principle. As the engine goes faster, it develops more horsepower, and she reaches her horsepower peak at around 45 to 50 miles an hour. Now, let's compare the pulling force of our two engines at 50 miles an hour. The 765 can still develop her full-rated 64,100 pounds of pulling force at that speed, but the diesel can only manage about 25,000 pounds of pulling force at that same speed. So how does this power curve translate to real-world performance? It differs from that of a diesel because anything that a steam engine could start, it can move at a good speed. Now, I admit I have oversimplified things a bit because we've not taken into account the rolling resistance of the train, which actually increases as the train goes faster, and other frictional losses on the locomotive itself, but that statement is basically true. A few years ago, we had an opportunity to test this theory to see if we could prove that the 765 was a better performer at high speed than a high horsepower diesel on the same train in identical weather conditions. This unofficial test occurred in September 1993 on an excursion from Cincinnati to Indianapolis on the former B&O. Now, for those of you that picture the state of Indiana as flat as a billiard table, you folks haven't seen southern Indiana. This route offered a couple of tough grades, one out of Hamilton, Ohio, and the other at Connorsville, Indiana. With 29 cars, the 765 would be hard-pressed to achieve any kind of speed on these grades, but we needed to keep moving in order to keep the running times manageable. So we tucked a 3,600 horsepower General Electric B36-7 in behind the auxiliary tender and hooked it to our diesel controller in the cab of the 765. During our layover in Indianapolis, I talked with Tom Stevens, the engineer who would run the engine going back to Cincinnati. We were both kind of curious about just how strong this diesel really was. I had only used it on the two big hills on the westbound trip and run the 765 pretty much the same way I always did, but we were both interested in seeing what this diesel could do by itself. Ready to depart Indianapolis on the way back to Cincinnati, the stage was set for the big test. Tom got the okay to proceed east, whistled off, and eased the train into motion with the diesel, working only enough steam on the 765 to keep lubrication flowing into the cylinders. In other words, the 765 was just pulling itself, and the big GE was pulling the train. Tom quickly notched the diesel up to run 8, and we could hear that engine barking with that distinctive GE heavy chugging sound. Speed began to build at a pretty respectable rate. At low speeds, The diesel was actually capable of accelerating the train somewhat faster than the 765 could. Remember those power curves? And at first we thought that maybe the diesel would be able to handle this train at track speed all by itself. But by the time we'd reached 30 miles an hour, the rate of acceleration had slowed dramatically. Tom had continued to adjust the throttle in reverse in the 765 to keep it set just to carry its own load. It took a long time to get from 30 to 35, but we were still accelerating. Finally, we reached a point where there was no more speed to be had. All 3,600 horses in the big GE were online and galloping as fast and as hard as they could. And they had us moving at the astounding speed of 38 miles an hour. That was it. There was no more. Finally, the CSX road foreman asked Tom why he was dogging it since we were already a little late. Tom answered by widening out on the throttle of the 765 and shutting the diesel back down to an idle. Within a mile, that big Lima Superpower Burke had us back up to 50 miles an hour with hardly any effort at all. It wasn't the steam locomotive's performance that ultimately led to its demise. Rather, it was the higher maintenance, fuel, and infrastructure costs that did it in. I think you can see from this quick analysis that a steam engine is actually a better performer at high speed than a comparable diesel.